Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and welcome to week two of our early American history. This week, we will be talking around the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and I just want to make some comments about those things. These are the areas that I have done a great deal of research in and have followed this story for years and years, and so I wanted just to make you aware of some things. One of the problems with historians are that we kind of get tunnel vision, and if we aren't careful, we will major on one thing and at the exclusion of everything else. And that has been something that's gone on in America for forever. And that is that we focus on the Puritan or the Pilgrims as though they were the only group of religious people in America, and that was not true. Let me go back and give you a little bit of history of the Puritans and the Pilgrims. These are two different groups by the time they come to America. Back in 1611, 1610, 11, the Queen had died in England, and so they brought James the Sixth from Scotland, who was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. He was the only living male heir to the throne. The English throne has always had a deficiency of male heirs, and when they were doing the progenitor thing, it didn't matter how many girls were born, the male heir would take precedence. And so that's still an issue today. I think they've just changed that to where William's children, if the oldest happened to have been a girl, could have served as queen. Now, the details of how Victoria and Elizabeth and all them got to be queen is another story that we'll leave with you for another time. But when James VI came, this group of Puritans, who the very name itself signifies they wanted to purify the Church of England. Remember, mid 1500s, Henry VIII took England out of the Catholic Church for a very different reason than the other Protestant countries did in the early 1500s, when Martin Luther led the revolt that divided the Catholic Church from the Protestants from the Catholics. Henry VIII did it because he could not get a divorce from his wife, so he could marry someone else. He is trying his best to get a male heir, of course, and so he marries several times, and he marries girls that he could get away with killing, basically. But then he married the wrong person. He married the sister of a king of another country, and for him to just off her would have meant a war. And so he tried to get the Catholic Church to annul the marriage. They would not. And so as a result, he dissolved the union between England and the Catholic Church and started his own church, of which he was the head, the Anglican Church. These Puritans wanted to purify and get rid of the Catholic elements in the church, and that's where the word purify, Puritan, came from, this very conservative group. They were strong at Cambridge and Oxford and different places. And so when James VI came, between Henry VIII, where his two daughters, Bloody Mary, who was a Catholic, and she killed all the Protestants, and Elizabeth, who was Protestant and killed all the Catholics. So it was a bloodbath all those years between Henry VIII and James I. When James I was on his way to his coronation, the Puritans met him on the road and gave him a list of demands and things that they'd like to see. And so he told them, let's get the coronation behind us and we'll meet and we'll discuss these things and see what can be done. And so you've got to realize that James I was coming from a country in Scotland, which was Presbyterian, and he was not the head of the church there. He was just a church member to take the throne of England where he was the head of the church. So it's not likely that he's going to turn England into a Presbyterian country. So he did not. When they met in 1604 at what was called the Hampton Court Conference, the only thing that James I allowed was a retranslation of the Bible, which we now know to be the King James Version of the Bible, 1611, in which he told and these were very good translators. Actually, the King James Bible is a very good translation, even if it's in Elizabethan English. The only thing he wanted them to do was to beef up the divine right of kings anywhere they found it in the scriptures. This was a new doctrine coming out of France, and so that's exactly what they did. But at that conference, there were two men there of interest. One was Hewells, that guy named Hewells, who was the first Baptist of record. And then there was James Robinson, who was the pastor of this little group of Christians in Scrooby, England, who later we would know as the Pilgrims. So when they broke with the Anglican Church at the 1604 conference, and so James I ran them out of England, and they went to Holland and stayed there for 11 years. The Baptist Representative Huell did come back to England and start a Baptist church there. He never came to America, but the Pilgrims, after 11 years, were losing their children, so they wanted to come to America to start over. Now, remember that they still have these views, these very Calvinistic Puritan views, but they're just not, they have given up on the Church of England, and so they come to America. The later group that comes to Boston, the Puritans, are those that are still in the Church of England, and during this time, they have literally killed, they beheaded Charles I, and for 11 years they had the Commonwealth under the Puritan reign, and it didn't go well. And by the time the 11 years was over, they were sick of, not dancing, not drinking, not smoking, not doing the things that the Puritans wouldn't allow them to do. And so when Oliver Cromwell, who was the Lord Protector, died at the end of the 11 years, they asked Charles II to come back and take the throne back over, so they get back into the monarchy thing. In the New World, the Puritans, who have received an inordinate amount of attention in American history, and you would think that's the only religious views that we had in America, captured the attention of historians now for 300 years. That community, which you'll be studying about this week, will eventually fail. Thomas Kidd, by the way, who wrote your textbook and of who I like very much, is actually a graduate of Clemson University, where I also graduated not far down the road, and has written some excellent works. If you ever get a chance to hear Thomas, you should. And if you ever get a chance to read more of his books, you should. He is a very, very good historian, and I'm really happy to have him as the textbook writer for this class. But there were other religious groups in America. There were other settlements that came up in America. In Virginia, you have the settlements that we also know about with Pocahontas and John Smith and all of them. They were basically Anglican and in the Church of England. And there are a lot of people that fled there after the beheading of Charles I. A lot of the people in the court fled to Virginia. They were called Roundheads, and they lived in exile all of these years when there was no monarchy and the Commonwealth was in play. There's also the settlement that pretty early on in Charleston, South Carolina, which was also Anglican in nature. And of course, Charleston was influenced by the influx from the Bahamas of thousands of slaves. Slavery started basically in Charleston to grow rice, not to grow cotton or anything else, but to grow rice. South Carolina grew and shipped some of the best rice in the world up until the Revolution on the backwaters and the eddies of the coast, because South Carolina has a very ragged coast, and so they had water they could pump into the rice fields and pump it out, of course, and did that. Another interesting thing about South Carolina is that over 2,500 Huguenots from France came to settle in the low country of South Carolina. Now, they were Protestants in France, and France has a very interesting history as far as the Reformation. They have the Reformation. They have the rise of Protestant believers. John Calvin was from France before he had to leave. And then they had a counter-Reformation in which the Catholic Church retook France and expelled thousands upon thousands of Huguenots. Now, the interesting thing about that, and this is something that my research has continually pointed to, the Huguenots were the wealthiest people in that society and the most skilled. And so when they left, they tried to prevent them from leaving at first because of those skills. When so many thousands of them left and went all over Europe, it weakened France to the point that I believe was a leading factor in the French Revolution is going to come in 1789. It really tore up the whole fabric of that society early before the French Revolution. Of course, French Revolution continued to destroy that, giving Napoleon the dictatorship. And so, but there are other religious people here. there are Buddhists in America. There are Muslims in America. There are all kind of other religious believers. And when we talk about, as we do today, people do, about America being a Christian nation, you need to really think through that statement, because America was never Christian in majority because of the presence of millions of Native Americans who practiced their own forms of religion. So you cannot really make that statement that America was majority Christian. It was not. The closest it may have ever come was the First Great Awakening, which we will talk about shortly. So think about those stories. You also have to be careful about books that are written. Washington Irving wrote a book about Columbus in 1800s that was just full of errors. The idea that the earth was square, that they feared they'd sell off the end of the earth. That was one of his statements. It was kind of like some fantasy book. So there's a lot of stuff. He wrote that as a tongue-in-cheek kind of a fantasy story for children, but he messed history up, because once you get something being taught in schools and told from a teacher, and they don't do their due diligence to find out where it came from, then you will set a whole generation onto a different path, and you cannot. It's just like untruth today. A lie can find its way where truth never could, and you cannot undo it. You cannot untell a lie. And so Washington Irving did history a great disservice with this book in the 1800s about Columbus, that much of it was where we get our folklore from, and say, well, this is this. So interestingly enough, that is kind of the landscape of the section you were talking about today with the Pilgrims. They were, one of the reasons, interestingly, the Pilgrims, when they left Scrooby, England, left in two ships. The Speedwell that they owned, they bought it from a used ship salesman, and the Mayflower, which they rented. The Speedwell leaked like a sieve, and so they had to put into Portsmouth, England, to get it stopped. They could not. Had it checked, and of course, this same guy wanted to buy the ship, said it couldn't be fixed. He bought it from them for a pittance and ran slaves for 50 years on that ship. You actually can trace that ship on the slave trade database. It's really interesting. And so now the Pilgrims had to put all their belongings, all their people on one ship, and it wouldn't fit. And so many of the initial members of that Scrooby congregation, including their pastor, John Robinson, stayed behind and did not get to go. And Robinson never got to come to America. As they stayed in port, it was expensive. You had to pay docking fees and have to have food and feed these people. They began to have to sell off the wares on the ship that they were going to bring to America to be sure they had enough food stuff to take care of themselves. They also had to bump Pilgrims to sell passage to non-Pilgrims, so that by the time they left on the Mayflower, they were not even in majority in their own ship. These others, as they called them, taunted them. They were not believers. They abused them. They did all kind of crazy things. And so that's why they did the Mayflower Compact, because when they came to the New World, these others were saying, well, we'll just wander off in the wilderness. Now think about that for a moment. There is nothing in America. There's not a Walmart. There's not a drugstore. There's not a grocery store. You're going to get off the ship. You have no idea how big this country is, and just wander away. You know that there are animals, wild animals. They had painted the natives as savages, so they were afraid of them. And so, I mean, what kind of person would just wander away and do that? And so they formed the Mayflower Compact to bind them together, because they knew unless they stuck together that they would die and not survive. And they almost did. The over half of that group, 153 people, I think, something like that, died in that first winter. Someone has projected that the temperature in the average Pilgrim's home was 43 degrees in the winter. Think about that. Native Americans did help them with some food, but then, as more ships kept coming, they realized more and more people were coming. They stopped that, and of course then had some other problems. My relative was on the first ship on the Mayflower. Somewhere along the way, either his wife fell overboard or committed suicide and jumped overboard. We're not sure which. But their son went on to be the first governor in the New World. And so quite an interesting story. I actually worked with a guy whose family was on the second ship coming after the Mayflower. And so there's a lot of ancestry there, a lot of things to think about. But these people really had a rugged time and a hard life getting things started. So as you read about the first Thanksgiving, I'm not sure how much of the story is real and how much of it is made up as we go along. With the telling of history, things get bigger and we get further away from facts. And so it might be the case where the Pilgrim story is embellished, and what they ate would have been quite different. Probably they didn't have turkey and dressing as the way we would know that. They would probably have had seafood at that meal, because seafood was a big part of their diet there. They would have had turkey, I'm sure, because of wild turkeys. But remember that there was no domesticated animals in the New World except the llama or the alpaca. There's some argument over whether there was some kind of a dog. We're not sure about that. But the Spanish introduced horses into there was no horse. They didn't use horses very much in New England, but they brought everything with them: cattle, chickens, everything. And that's where the natives didn't have the immunity, and many millions of them died from being exposed to people with no immunity. And we have what's called the Columbia Triangle of movement of goods. Once they get established, they're moving goods from the New World to England. From England, they're going to Africa to get slaves, bringing slaves back. There is a transference of immunity and disease and everything that you can imagine. The discovery of the New World made quite a difference in England. To be honest, Europe was pretty well at the bottom when the New World was discovered. This was a tremendous encouragement because land was not available anyway. It was all tied up in these estates, as you hear on TV now talking about the king owning this town and that city. It's still that way in England. There's not a great deal of property to be had. When they came here and saw all of this land, and according to their view, land that was not used was free for the taking. And so their ideas about land ownership versus land ownership by Native Americans, who held all land common to the tribe, and then each family was given a parcel to work, make their garden, grow food locally and all this stuff. But the land itself was held by the Cherokee or by the Onondaga or whoever the tribe was. So when these Europeans came, they just took what they wanted. And very few of them had the ethics to try to deal with buying it from the Indians. The Dutch bought Manhattan, and Roger Williams bought Rhode Island. But certain people, they didn't see that as a need. Plus, the Pope puts out this encyclical in 1493, which is really, I think I mentioned it last time, really important, that said any heathens or savages that could not claim land because they were not God's first order, and they were against God and against spiritual things. So Christians had the first right to ownership and could take the land and use it any way that they wanted to. Even though the England had left the Catholic Church, this encyclical was so much to their good that they keep it. So they hold on to this Catholic piece of paper, and that becomes, even all the way up to Elizabeth and Mary and James, that piece of paper becomes the defining document of why they felt like they could take the land from Indians and force them off of it. And then Americans will pick up that same idea after 1776. So hopefully I haven't bored you to tears. This is some great things to know. A lot of it comes from my personal research, so you may not read it in that context. But I hope that it will make you want to read and learn more about Puritans and Pilgrims. know that there were two different groups of them. They agreed theologically, they just didn't agree politically. The Puritans were hoping the Anglicans would bring back Christian values to England. In fact, they were discussing when they came to build Boston, and they came here waiting for God to destroy England, and then they would go back and set up another theocracy. The words you're hearing in that are the same words we're hearing today in this Christian nationalism of wanting to set up a theocracy in which God rules, and it's important that we understand that. Okay, enough for today. Look forward to talking to you next week. You may comment, get in touch with me, talk about this any way you want to, but I hope it's helpful. Thanks.